Excellences, Mesdames et Messieurs, c'est un grand honneur et un plaisir de vous accueillir pour la discussion de ce matin qui est intitulée Emploi et compétences, les clés d'un avenir meilleur. Cette discussion s'inscrit bien entendu dans le cadre des forums thématiques organisés dans le cadre de la célébration du centenaire de l'Organisation internationale du travail. Comme vous le savez, depuis la mise en place en 2017 de la Commission mondiale sur l'avenir du travail, ces 2 dernières années ont vu un débat très riche, un débat très soutenu, un débat qui a métamorphosé le monde du travail et les questions du monde du travail. Beaucoup d'entre vous conviendront que les emplois et les compétences ont toujours été au cœur de nos échanges et ce sont précisément ces 2 aspects que nous abordons aujourd'hui. Lorsque nous réfléchissons à ce que seront les emplois et les compétences de demain, plusieurs questions viennent naturellement à l'esprit. Quelle sera la source de ces nouveaux emplois? Quel type de compétences nécessiteront-ils? Comment les systèmes d'enseignement et de formation pourront-ils valoriser au mieux ces compétences de manière à réduire au minimum leur inadéquation? En l'espèce, il n'y a pas de réponse toute faite. Les progrès technologiques, intelligence artificielle, automatisation et robotique vont tous créer de nouveaux emplois. Mais certaines personnes devront s'adapter et il nous appartient d'œuvrer collectivement pour veiller à ce que le filet de sécurité sociale leur permette effectivement de réussir cette transition. Les compétences font partie de ce tableau. Les compétences d'aujourd'hui ne correspondront pas aux emplois de demain et les savoir-faire nouvellement acquis risquent d'être fort rapidement dépassés. Mesdames et Messieurs, comme vous l'avez constaté, la Commission mondiale a proposé un programme d'action centré sur l'humain pour un avenir de travail et formulé à cet effet 3 recommandations capitales. Premièrement, la Commission a préconisé d'investir davantage dans les capacités des personnes physiques. Il s'agit de les aider à évoluer en favorisant l'apprentissage tout au long de la vie et en renforçant le système de protection sociale. Deuxièmement, la Commission a recommandé d'investir davantage dans les institutions du travail. Enfin, elle a préconisé d'investir davantage dans le travail décent et durable. La promotion du travail décent par la mise en place de mécanismes encourageant les investissements à long terme. Dans l'ensemble, ces recommandations insistent fortement sur l'apprentissage tout au long de la vie et sur la nécessité pour les partenaires sociaux de collaborer afin de s'assurer que les systèmes d'enseignement et de formation font preuve de plus grande réactivité face au monde du travail. Ces idées ne sont pas nouvelles, me direz-vous, en soi, mais le sentiment croissant qu'il est urgent d'agir ainsi que la longueur du délai requis pour modifier les systèmes exige que nous considérions ces défis comme nouveaux. Au vu des dites recommandations, nous invitons les membres du panel ici présents à la session de la Conférence internationale du travail à saisir cette occasion exceptionnelle pour aborder les défis à relever et envisager les solutions. Je vais, si vous me permettez, maintenant passer la parole à Madame Nizifo Mbanje. J'espère que j'ai bien prononcé son nom. C'est elle qui va conduire le débat ici. Elle est une modératrice qui a une renommée internationale et qui a une efficacité à pousser les intervenants et les panélistes dans leur dernier retranchement. Madame Nizifo, vous avez la parole. Je vous remercie.
Mr. Amaru, thank you very much for a gracious introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. It is an absolute honor and an absolute privilege for me to moderate today's sessions. And Mr. Amaru, thank you for setting the context. And ladies and gentlemen, I think the context is absolutely important for the conversation that we're about to have. It is important for us to take note of the global changes that are shaping the world of work. More importantly so, because they represent both opportunities and challenges. On the one hand, they are opportunities that could see the creation of entirely new industries. We could see the increase of jobs. We could see an acceleration towards the attainment of the Sustainable Development Goals. But having said that, and in the same breath, they also pose a challenge, and a challenge that can manifest in the disruption of labor markets. And in this particular conversation, a disruption in labor market that calls for new skills, for constant upskilling and reskilling over the life course. And to reiterate the words of Mr. Amaru, making lifelong learning an undeniable reality of the emerging world of work. So in this conversation, we're going to be asking, how might we begin to tackle some of the challenges that are brought about by these transformative changes? How might we think innovatively in terms of how we respond from a policy perspective? And is there an opportunity to reframe, to pivot, to rethink policy so that we are able to better support and facilitate lifelong learning? Now, ladies and gentlemen, before I introduce my panelists, I just want to give you a quick overview of how we're going to run this conversation. We're going to start off with a moderated conversation here on stage. However, we're going to expand this conversation. We're going to open up the conversation. And we're going to do this in two ways. The first way is that we're going to call on a country-specific case study, the case study of Switzerland, in terms of what is possible when different stakeholders come together to work towards lifelong learning. So we'll hear some of the voices that are going to be inputting into that case study. But this conversation is also yours. And so we're going to open up the conversations to questions and answers and comments that will come from the floor as well. And I will invite you to claim your share of voice in the conversation and to participate as well. Having said that, let me get straight into introducing my panelists today. We are joined by Mr. José Gurria, the Secretary General of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, waving there. Mr. Mario Cimoli, on this end, is also joining us. He's the Deputy Executive Secretary for the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean. Welcome, sir. Mr. Filippo Grandi, closest to me, is High Commissioner at the UNHCR, that's the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. We're joined also by Madame Mary Lou, right at the end. Ms. Mary is the President of the National Trade Union Congress in Singapore. On the other far end, flanking the gentleman, is Madame Dimple Agrawal. She is a managing partner with Deloitte. And last but certainly not least in this conversation is Mr. Torben Albrecht. He is a commissioner of the Global Commission on the Future of Work, but also wears the hat of federal manager of the Social Democratic Party of Germany. Welcome to all my panelists, and thank you very much for making the time to join us. Now, I think a good place for us to start this conversation is to actually start by looking at the impact of these transformations in the world. And in particular, the extent to which they are impacting on global production networks, the extent to which they are shaping the quantity and the quality of jobs that are coming through. I'd like to hear your thoughts as well in terms of some of the policies, economic and labor policies, that could facilitate the transformation of the economies that will be required if we are going to be able to produce decent jobs in the future. And lastly, whether these global transformations, be it digital, demographic, be it climate change, be it globalization, also can be leveraged as an opportunity for the formalization of work. So I'm going to start off with Mr. Gurria to share his thoughts on this broad theme on how we may be able to start responding to some of these changes. Over to you, sir.
Well, first of all, we have to take into consideration the megatrends: digitalization, globalization, demographic change. These are the forces that we're dealing with. We just dived into these in our ministerial council meeting, the Future Work Project, and 50 million jobs were created in the OECD countries, but 4 out of 10 were in highly digital intensive sectors, which shows you where the problem or where the challenge is. Of course, great potential to improve the lives, great potential to leapfrog, but at the same time, 14% of the workforce today highly exposed to being displaced by technology, 32% additional being disrupted by technology, so about half of the workforce altogether having some impact on the technology, and roughly about half the workforce not prepared to be operating in highly technological working environments. Now, there's also the other problem, which is risking the growth of inequalities. The crisis left us with low growth, with a destruction of many jobs. We're only now recovering, but also with with growing inequalities. And the question of digital and the challenges it poses on the world of work is that for those that are not digitalized, if you will, there's a very great danger that the differences will just grow and grow and grow. And there's this paradox. The ones who need the training most are the ones who will have the access least. And therefore, you have, in the absence of public policies, you will have a very, very serious growth in the inequalities out of the digital rather than the promise that it holds. One of the big differences is that it could exacerbate, for example, the gender inequalities. 86% of all the teams that do software in the world are male only, for example. You know, just a little proof of the bias that this can introduce. But this is a very, very serious problem because, as I said, it can exacerbate things. Of course, you need sound macroeconomics. You need skills, as was mentioned, upskilling, reskilling. You need laws that protect, but you also need the coverage.
Yeah.
And then you have to face the so-called non-standard, which are the result of the digital, but at the same time, we should even do away with the non-standard language because more and more and more they're becoming like the rule every day. The adult learning, that means the concept that you play for 5 years, you educate yourself for 20 years, and then you go and work for 30 or 40 years and you retire, or then you die. That's it. Obviously, that is no longer the case. You have to introduce in the 30 or 40 years of work the constant concept of learning. And then, of course, to do this in a dialogue with the social forces. We at the OECD, together with the ILO, are working precisely on the social dialogue, this initiative by the Swedes. And then to fight informality. I come from a country, Mexico, where close to 60% of the workforce is informal. We have countries where it's even greater. The problem that you have there is that informality is the greatest enemy of skills, is the greatest enemy of the loyalty of the workers with the companies to the workers, and therefore of the capacity to be able to prepare the workers for the challenges to come.
A very comprehensive answer. Thank you very much, Mr. Greer, and touching on a lot of important points. But one of the things that I want to build on, I mean, Mr. Greer, Mr. Grandi speaks about 50% is the number that he's shared with us. He says about 50% of the workforce will be impacted. But we know that there's an additional lens that we need to think about. We need to think about the most vulnerable groups, the refugees, the immigrants. So from your perspective in the work that you do in that space, how do you respond then to make sure that we are bringing in the voices of the most vulnerable into this conversation?
Yes.
Yeah.
Mr. Correa spoke about people work displaced by technology. I deal with more than 70 million people that are already displaced by something else, by war, by violence, sometimes combined with poverty, climate effect. And then, by virtue of being displaced in this manner, they are also fundamentally and often excluded from the transformation that we're talking about, which is of benefit to the rest to some other people, to the rest of the world of work. I want to just flag one point that people forget. We always think of refugees and work here in Europe, in North America. No, 85% of refugees, displaced, stateless people are in poor countries, middle-income countries. Most of their access to work is informal, to just go back to the point made. Their exclusion is multiple and has a lot of impact on their ability to work. They have no documentation, often no freedom of movement. They're excluded from financial services. The digital gap, as was mentioned, is particularly big, and education is a remote opportunity. Missing out on the transformation in all these areas not only excludes them further, but puts them at risk of many types of manipulation, abuse, and often prompts them towards secondary movements at the hands of traffickers and smugglers, with the consequences, even political, that we've seen in the world today. So what we are really promoting, including through the Global Compact on Refugees and the Global Compact on Migration, there's two global compacts, is really inclusive policies, which are a big responsibility of host countries, for which they need to be supported and helped. We promote providing them with documentation and identification through digital means in particular. We speak about, of course, skilling. It was already mentioned, and education in appropriate way. And very important, all of this not focusing exclusively on refugees, migrants, displaced people, but on communities hosting them. Because if you create otherwise a gap there, the political backlash can be very severe.
So again, we're coming to this idea that the size of the challenge is somewhat greater than we sometimes always frame it as. And this is where I'm going to go with you, Mr. Chimole, because we know that there's a unique perspective that is coming from developing markets or developing countries, a unique perspective that comes from emerging markets. Mr. Grandi has just shared with us how sometimes we have an incomplete sense of this idea of migration and refugees, that even within these countries, this problem is real. So let me ask you just to share with us, from a developing country, emerging markets perspective, how do we begin to see the impact of these transformations?
Thank you. I think that there is an important distinction. When we speak about this issue, we have to have differences between this job and skills.
Right.
Many of the studies that we have say different results. In countries, they said, with a new revolution, digital revolution, job is going to increase. Others say, no, it's going to decrease. It's going to be reduced. There is no agreement about that. It's not clear what's happening. What is clearly, it is important to understand, is that there is an enormous gap between middle-income economies and development economies and the more developed one. Because, for example, that is clear in countries like Germany and other countries, digital is creating jobs. In Latin America and other countries, digitalization is not creating, it has a negative impact on informality and small and medium firms. You have to understand that in Latin America, for example, 80% of employment, 80% is in small and medium firms. If you take those firms, only 5-10% of those firms have some type of digitalization. At least it's web page and something like that. There is an enormous job to do with this type of firm, small and medium firms, informality. On the other side, it's not only if you are going to lose job. Be careful about that. Many of the function skills are going to be restructured.
Yeah.
As to be diversify. It's not the job, it's mention that you have and to be changed. And this is very important, because if you take like that, the impact is not to be so negative. What's happened, I want to be very clear on that there is an enormous gap what's happened, for example, with developing economies and non-developing one. Because I want to be clearly, developed economy has industrial policy and technological policy. Many of the economy in developing countries don't have those policies. And if you don't have those policies, it's clearly that it's difficult to understand how to increase productivity, how to create a new job, and how to incorporate digitalization to the structure of this economy.
So what is clear from what we've heard so far in the conversation is that these transformative changes are going to have an impact. They're already having an impact. I'd like to move our conversation forward a little bit and begin to think about and to talk about what kind of policy innovations does this then call on. And in particular, I want us to remain on the underlying theme of how do we ensure that those policy innovations are inclusive and that they are relevant for all, including the most vulnerable? So, Mr. Albrecht, I'm going to come to you first. And I'm going to ask you to, in the work that you do, to share some of the outcomes of policy innovation and what that could potentially look like.
Yes, thank you very much. I think it became clear already that the skill requirements for workers are changing very quickly and will be changing also over the coming years. And our challenge is to make sure that no one is left behind. So how could we do that? Let me share two quick ideas about that. One is everybody's talking about we need active labor market policies. If somebody becomes unemployed, he or she needs education, skilling, etc. I think this is no longer sufficient.
Right.
We have to move from active employment policies to proactive policies that already engage with people, train people when they're still in their job, but are endangered to lose their job due to technological change. So we have to invest in people while they're still working, and in Germany we have taken the first steps into that direction. A second idea would be, why shouldn't we equip people at the beginning of their working life with a universal opportunities account? Rather than making or moving people out of work through a universal basic income, help them to go through their working life and go through transitions. Have some account they can use for retraining, but also for starting a business through their working life. And it's also an issue of equality, because you can see that the preconditions people have when starting into their working lives differ from their family background. But if everybody gets this kind of opportunities account, he or she has a better chance, a more equal chance to have a decent working life and to adapt to the skill changes needed in the future. So, two salient things. The first is the timing of when we make this universal opportunities account while they're still working, and also just the bold idea of making this a reality. What I'd like to do is to maybe get the voice of Ms. Agrawal into here, because coming from Deloitte as well, you must have a line of sight in terms of how business and the private sector is responding to the need for lifelong learning. Yes, we have to talk about policy innovations, but how is business responding to this emerging future?
Yes, sure. Just two key points to add to the conversation we just heard just now. I think two things are, one, whilst there are some whole jobs that are being, if you like, disrupted or displaced because of digitization and automation, in the private sector, in the main, there are tasks within jobs that are actually being displaced. So we have to be careful to not provide a very generic statement that X million jobs are being displaced. And that's actually a good thing, because if certain tasks within jobs are actually changing, you can fill the time of people who used to do those full jobs with new skills and abilities to complement what they were doing. All our research and all our work with clients indicates that actually more jobs are being created, and actually what's happening is productivity should increase, but what we need to learn is to get humans to work with machines in a much better way. We don't know that as yet because that's not what we have been doing for the last few decades. The second point I wanted to make is, in addition to everything else that has been said, there is a huge, I think, opportunity to get people to really double down on the uniquely human skills, because that's where robots and machines and artificial intelligence yet cannot compensate for humans. So whether it's complex problem solving or whether it's more cognitive and social skills, whether it's creativity, those are the skills that are going to be more valuable and cannot, at least yet we don't know, that can be replaced by machines very easily. So that's quite important. And just to answer the question on what are we seeing in terms of how organizations are responding to lifelong learning, I think our private sector has responded quite significantly in terms of putting in place digital platforms to allow people to learn when they can, how they can, in very small chunks and bite-sized learning. So the whole notion of classroom learning, for example, is going down quite significantly. And also very personalized learning is important. Just like we have gotten consumers who have gotten very used to buying personalized products, we need to think about how can we make learning more personalized and more relevant to an individual rather than groups of individuals. So I think the key thing is flexibility, the key thing is digitization, and we have to remember that 70% of learning takes place on the job and not in classrooms. So we have to really rethink how learning can be imparted to people. And again, the private sector is responding to that quite significantly.
And the private sector is responding, from what I'm hearing, by really being innovative around their own business models, identifying that it's tasks and not entire jobs at times, but also elevating the importance of the human skill. I want to juxtaposition this against the experience from the perspective of workers. And in particular, maybe Ms. Mary, if you could just share with us the experience in Singapore and how unions and workers are responding to the need to be more innovative in response to lifelong learning. There's a lot of technology around us here on stage, so just bear with us. I think go ahead, they'll boost you.
Hello,
yeah?
Can you hear me? Yeah, thank you, Nazipong, and very good morning to all. And indeed, transformation is not entirely new. We have gone through the industrial age, and we have gone through economy, knowledge economy, and so on. But the thing is that what is happening right now in Industry 4.0 is happening so fast. The pace is so much quicker, and there are concerns, among the workers as well. I think just now our panelists has spoken very eloquently that it is a real serious issue. And for us is that how do we want to go about it? Well, at the end of the day, what is it in for the workers? There are concerns, and we understand the concerns that where they are coming from. And I think in Singapore, we look into this particular area, and the tripartite partners, especially this initiative, we call that the Industry Transformation Map. This is an initiative by the government and actually co-created together with the tripartite partners. So which means the unions are on board, the employers are on board as well. And we came up with 23 industry transformation maps. And this 23 industry transformation map actually cover more than 80% of our GDP. And with that, I think it is also important for us then to look at it, to drill down into the industry specific. And each industry actually has got pillars, strong pillars as well, that actually address the economic issues as well as the labor issues as well. And I think it is very important that when we look at it, we have the pillar of productivity, innovation, and I'm glad that we have one very strong pillar inside there as well, and that is jobs and skill. So that is also very important. And then we went on to internationalization. So with this itself, we then actually assure our people that the business actually has to innovate. And as well as workers, you have to upskill and you have to reskill as well. But the important thing is that we are not going through the journey alone by ourselves. Among the workers, we can do it just by our own. so are the employers, so are the government as well. We need a collaboration, and that is where the tripartism comes in. Tripartite partners have to work together to go through the journey of transformation, to give the assurance to our workers, so that our workers actually can have better wages in turn, and can have better benefits and better work prospects as well.
So an emphasis there on working together, but also on industry-specific innovation. So, Mr. Gray, I'd like to get your voice on this. In your first response, you touched on the importance of solid macroeconomic policy that needs to be in place so that we're able to really translate and make the most of the opportunities that come out of these changes. Could you give us a comment on your thoughts on labor market policies in particular? How can we be innovative with labor market policy? And I'd like you to consider the suggestion from Ms. Mayer, who says maybe we need to be thinking at an industry-specific level.
Well, the question is that many of the principles, which all have been mentioned here, are not happening. They're still not in law. And if they are in law, they're still not being enforced. So we know enough about what it takes. We also know enough about the challenge, for example, that Filippo's group there, all the migrants, all the refugees. Now we find out, for example, in the case of Syrians, about a third of them actually have diplomas, have very high qualifications. The question is, do we identify them in time?
Yeah.
Do we actually bring up those qualifications? Do we actually put them to work? And do we not have a situation, which we do, of course, that they're mostly overqualified in the jobs that they're occupying, which means we're missing out on their own capacities. Language, of course, yes, obviously, but the whole question of recognizing their skills, again, it's a question of skills. Then we say lifelong learning should be the rule, but it isn't. Actually, it's a very stable and mostly what I would call like a photo rather than a movie, you know, with the question of lifelong learning. Our friends from Deloitte, our friends from Singapore are telling us, you know, what it should be like, but it's not happening. Every company, every enterprise should be a school. Every large company should be a university, actually. And the reason why they should do it is for their own interest. They don't have to be, you know, generous or charitable. If they do it for their own interest, they will increase productivity and they will increase their own competitiveness. And therefore, they will help their own case. Now, you have many cases where there is a transformative view. Germany, for example, which always was a pioneer in terms of apprenticeships, etc., now is changing completely the outlook in terms of the training and there are a number of countries that are, Nordic countries are leading the charge more generally. But basically, what I would say is that the question of skills and lifelong learning and vocational training is something that we have not only to put in the books, but actually have to have active labor policies and active education policies, and then a very good combination of the private sector together with the authorities, together with the trade unions, together with the individuals. And in the services economy, less and less people are in trade unions, and therefore you have to also have the dialogue with the civil society at large in order to make sure that actually the question of lifelong learning happens and that the skills are provided in order to make sure that they get the best side, we'd say the bright side of innovation rather than the darker side, which actually threaten the workforce.
I'm keen to get to our third theme, but before I do that, I mean, I think this is two really beautiful analogies. The one analogy is that could we be stuck in a photo world when we should be in a movie? I thought that was a great analogy that you've used there. But the last analogy of the bright side versus the dark side, because if we are talking about the innovation of policy, and what we're hearing is that there's a real gap between what we say is required and what we actually do on the ground. I get the sense that it's darker than the dark when we begin to think about the most vulnerable groups. A quick comment on how do we ensure that as we innovate around policy, we're innovating with inclusivity in mind, and real inclusivity at that.
I love it that when it comes to the dark side, you look at me. But Jose Angel is on the bright side, I'm on the dark side. I take it in my stride, but I would say 4 quick things.
Yeah.
I mentioned some in my first intervention, but 4 quick things when you talk about the displaced of the displaced, right? The most marginalized. One is very much what Jose Angel said about recognizing skills. You know, we always say, oh, you know, refugees, migrants have a lot of skills. We don't really know much about those skills. We're doing a lot of work with ILO, with the World Bank in this area to try to have a better sense of what those skills are and how we can put them to move them to the bright side. Second, the education gap. This is dramatic. You know, let me talk only about refugees. 23% refugees in primary schools. 61% of refugees in primary schools. The global average is over 90%. 23% in secondary school. The global average is much higher. 1% in university. Sure. The global average is 32%. So there is a huge gap there that needs to be addressed for people that often have little mobility. You know, the Daffy German scholarships are a great invention. We're celebrating their 25th anniversary next week in Berlin. This is the type of things, and there's many others that I can mention. Connected learning, ideally we would like to bring all these people where they can get better skills. It's impossible. So we need to be creative on how to bring learning to them. Third, I think create work in very fragile areas. I don't know how much this has been discussed this week. This is a big challenge. We're working with the IFC, with the World Bank in refugee camps in Kenya to do that. This is how you harness the potential of refugees as entrepreneurs as well. And that is very important. And this is quite key. And then, of course, the whole issue of the digital divide. That's another very big one. For people that have no documentation, it's more than digital. It's digital and identity divide. Yeah. People that have no identity. The two can go together through digital ID. If you don't have documentation, you cannot have access to financial services, to loans, to insurance, to registering your business. So all this needs to be addressed. I just want to make a final comment. You fully appreciate that I am here. I'm the head of a humanitarian organization. I think it is indicative of the times we live in that I come here and talk about these things. And that a humanitarian organization like mine works with ILO, works with the World Bank, works with the private sector in trying to address these issues. We cannot think anymore of this phenomena of human mobility, of extreme human mobility, through simply humanitarian responses. Yeah. We have to marry humanitarian with development. That's the only way to go forward.
So we're changing this to the light side, just to make sure that everybody is happy. But I think some really, really salient points that you've raised, and some practical examples of how we begin to penetrate into those spaces and really make working a reality. A quick comment from you, Mr. Chimoli. We're talking about innovations in labor market policy, but maybe you could come in with a comment on innovations around fiscal policy, because the reality is, whether it's developing countries, emerging markets, that there's going to have to be some fiscal policy innovation to support lifelong learning on the part of governments. A quick comment from you on that.
I think you put clearly, when we think about how we create a job in the digital area, is not only because we have a labor market, only industrial policy and technological policy. It's clearly now that we need also the capability to create a competition policy and a regulation policy, because many times those firms are so large and so strong with respect to the state that there is no way to create jobs. It's difficult, and you need to regulate that, and you need the opportunity have to regulate that. When you regulate that, you understand which are the sources for fiscal action, because we need new fiscal action for new policy, and we need resources. That is very important. But there is a problem when we speak about middle-income countries. Take case of Latin America. Many of those firms that working on digitalization are not in Latin America. There is some, but there is no. When we speak about creating the relation between university and firms, we don't have those capabilities from the firms. Yeah. We need another type of model that relate with these new type of firms. I think that is very important. But think about that. With the digital area, it's not only to say we created new jobs, it's only skills. For me, it's also the issue to rethink about which type of competition policy. Yeah. We access to the market. And I want to make a point about what Filippo said. The program that ECLAC put on wave about Central America and Mexico, the central program Latin America, Filippo, is based on that idea. We have to create a job in Central America. Yeah. We need to create an industrial technological policy and opportunity. It's not only the administration of law. That is our idea. That is our focus. And I think all of you think the same thing, and that is the way to work on that.
So again, this conversation, I think, is surfacing the need for even deeper conversations. We have another conversation starting here that I'm going to end. But what I would like us to do is to maybe transition to the third theme. We've spoken about the impact on of the transformations. We've spoken a little bit about the kind of policy innovations that we'd like to see. The final theme, and I'm going to ask Ms. Mary and Ms. Agrawal to weigh in on this, is how do we then incentivize workers to participate in lifelong learning opportunities? How do we incentivize employers, Ms. Agrawal, to participate in lifelong learning? So let me start off with you, and then we'll come to the voice of the workers.
Sure. Businesses actually know that they won't exist if they don't respond to this transformation, right? So all data tells us that X number of Fortune 500 companies that existed even 10 years ago don't exist today. And we know that list is going to look very different in another 10 years. So I think businesses are very aware of that. Our research tells us that actually 87% of companies believe that they need to rebaseline the entire talent base. Only 11% believe that they have leaders actually to lead them through this transformation. So there is a huge realization for that. And that is why they have started taking steps. But like, as was said earlier by the gentleman, that we know what it should be, but we are not yet there. Because it requires a huge cultural shift. It requires a cultural shift in how to make lifelong learning available. It requires a cultural shift even amongst the workers to think about themselves, to say actually they may become redundant if they don't keep upskilling themselves. So we have to make learning meaningful, we have to make it relevant, we have to make it personalized, and I think we need to make learning more fun than it has been in the corporate world.
All right, so what we've heard from Ms. Agrawal, Ms. Mary, we need to make it relevant, we need to make it meaningful, and we need to make it more fun. Are those the kind of incentives that are going to resonate with workers for them to participate in lifelong learning opportunities?
Thank you. Indeed, we need to make it more fun. And it's no longer school-based, classroom-based, and we have to go beyond. So in Singapore, our education ministers has gone through a lot of revamp as well, because about lifelong learning is not just about in the classroom, what we achieve, but we have to go beyond that. And with that, I must say that the Singapore Labour Movement, the SNTUC, we have also actively been engaging our workers. And with that, we actually have the NTUC Education and Training Fund, and we work with the Institute of Higher Learning to come up with actually bite-sized courses. Bite-sized courses that are portable. that you can learn to your convenience, in any way, and make it a bit more fun, like more engaging. I think that's very important as well. And not only that, we have recently also came up with the CTC. By calling it the CTC, meaning Company Training Committee.
Right.
We are actually working very closely with the ground. Our union leaders are reaching out to the companies and having to form that committee together with them and have this two-way platform to have this engagement for them as well, so that we are telling the company that we are together with you. We want to transform together with you, and if the company do well, the benefits also goes to the workers as well. So with this CTC, what is this CTC about? We are actually aiming to have 1,000 CTC in 3 years' time. That will benefit more than 330,000 members. And not only that, with this CTC, we are actually talking about helping the workers to accelerate, to accept technology. Because we are fearful, because a number of them do not know whether they will lose a job tomorrow, whether they can continue with their skills that they are having right now to stay employable in the future. So with CTC, we help them to accelerate their acceptance. At the same time, to understand the plans of the company well, and also to help the company to accelerate not only the acceptance part, but the adoption part as well.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah.
And lastly, not only the adoption part, but we actually actualize it because we want to make sure that the company and the workers benefits.
So, ladies and gentlemen, a very practical example coming from Singapore about how business and employers are working together to make sure that, one, there's a mindset shift, but also that the skilling and the reskilling is actually taking place. Now, I made a promise at the beginning of this conversation. I said we'd open up the conversation and bring in a country-specific case study before opening up to questions and answers. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to ask you to bear with me because the voices that are going to be participating in this part of the conversation are seated right here in front of me, and the gentlemen have been following the conversation. We have with us in the room today, we've got Mr. Boris Zurcher, who's sitting right in the center. He's the Secretary of State for Economic Affairs in Switzerland, and he's going to be giving us his experience and his insights from that perspective. On this side, we have Mr. Blaise Methai. He's the Director General for the Federation of Enterprises, also here in Switzerland. And then to complete the case study, we're going to be bringing in the voice of Mr. Luca Cigliano, who is from SGB USS, and bringing in the voice of the unions from that perspective. And so maybe, Mr. Zurcher, you could kick us off. We know that when we think about Switzerland in the global landscape, we think about an efficient and an effective vocational education system. But maybe give us your insights and your experience from your seat in terms of how you have participated and contributed to making lifelong learning an emerging reality and a reality here.
Partenaires sociaux, on va y retourner. On parle de la Suisse d'un modèle de succès. Peut-être chose tout rapidement illustrer ce que ça veut dire. On a un taux de chômage très faible. On a une participation au marché du travail très très élevée, parmi les plus élevés dans les pays de l'OCDE. On a des inégalités très faibles. La part du revenu du travail, par exemple, n'a pas diminué en Suisse, elle est très très stable et pour finir, on a probablement les salaires les plus élevés du monde, je peux dire, même si on corrige pour le pouvoir d'achat. Donc effectivement, je crois du point de vue du marché du travail, de la politique du marché du travail, la Suisse est un succès. Je crois il y a deux éléments clés qui sont à la base de ce succès. Ceux qui connaissent la Suisse savent que la Suisse est un pays très décentralisé, fédéraliste. Donc il y a deux valeurs qui sont essentielles. Je crois une culture du dialogue et une culture de responsabilité. Peut-être je peux élaborer un peu sur ces deux points. La culture du dialogue, bien sûr, c'est nécessaire. Et c'est surtout nécessaire, pas juste quand on a une crise, ou bien quand on est confronté avec une crise, mais c'est une culture qui doit être entérinée en permanence, et ça doit être entretenu, et c'est beaucoup de travail. Je peux par exemple, justement les partenaires sociaux jouent un rôle clé là-dedans, mais aussi toutes les associations professionnelles qui sont à l'écoute aussi de l'économie, qui sont à l'écoute des besoins du marché du travail, mais qui sont aussi à l'écoute des travailleurs, qui sont aussi en train de mettre en place, par exemple, des programmes de formation, etc., justement pour rester à jour avec les compétences. Alors ça, c'est essentiel, cette culture du dialogue. Une culture de responsabilité. Bien sûr, les incitations doivent être correctes, les entreprises doivent être confrontées avec des incitations qui ne mènent pas à des dérapages économiques, ça c'est tout à fait clair, mais aussi les individus. Par exemple, on a une loi sur la formation continue en Suisse. La responsabilité primaire est chez l'individu. C'est lui qui est responsable pour sa propre formation. Donc, il a aussi besoin de régulièrement s'adapter, réfléchir, est-ce que mes compétences sont encore à jour, est-ce que je dois faire quelque chose? Et il y a aussi une responsabilité vers les entrepreneurs, justement. C'est eux qui doivent faciliter que les travailleurs peuvent exécuter leurs responsabilités. Donc, je crois que ça, c'est deux éléments essentiels. À part de ça, je crois une conviction forte en Suisse, c'est que du point de vue de la politique économique, on n'est pas là pour faire le micromanagement dans les marchés, mais qu'on travaille justement sur les conditions cadres. En Suisse, on est plutôt sceptique à mettre en place les grandes stratégies, les grands plans. Ça, c'est quelque chose que justement les acteurs qui ont cette responsabilité doivent mettre en place. C'est eux qui sont au premier front.
Thank you very much for your contribution, Mr. Zurcher. And Mr. Zurcher speaks about frameworks that are in place and creating a conducive environment, a system that is based on dialogue, a system that is based on shared responsibility, and a system that allows for the opportunity for continuous training. But let's get this perspective from business. And in particular, what the inherent challenges are for business, where business has been able to take the opportunities that this environment that Mr. Zurcher has outlined for us is made possible. Mr. Mathe, your thoughts on that?
Myself in French. Il y a en Suisse la conviction profonde que comme nous n'avons pas de matière première, notre matière première, c'est l'éducation. Et au-delà du cadre que vous venez de mentionner, c'est des convictions personnelles et collectives qui font de l'action dans le domaine de l'éducation. Donc la première des constatations que j'ai été amené à faire en présidant un nombre de commissions consacrées à l'éducation et à la formation continue, c'est qu'il faut un engagement personnel et collectif pour qu'on puisse faire en sorte d'avoir une bonne éducation de base, une bonne formation continue et surtout une adaptation continue de la formation. Dans notre pays, la voie privilégiée est celle de l'apprentissage pour 2/3 des élèves. Ce n'est pas forcément ce qu'on peut trouver à l'extérieur, mais c'est une voie qui est connectée en permanence à l'entreprise. C'est l'entreprise qui fournit la place d'apprentissage, c'est l'entreprise qui va donner son savoir, c'est l'entreprise qui va libérer l'apprenti pour qu'il puisse aller suivre des cours, soit avec d'autres entreprises, soit à l'école. Et cette voie de l'apprentissage est une voie qui vous permet de partir ensuite dans toutes les directions si vous le souhaitez. Comme l'a souligné le secrétaire d'État, c'est une décision individuelle que de savoir si on veut aller au-delà de la formation de base et entrer dans ce qu'on appelle les universités professionnelles ou les académies. Tout est possible, le système est compliqué. Si vous regardez les schémas publiés sur le web, vous aurez de la peine à vous y retrouver, mais ça marche. Voilà, ce qu'on peut dire, c'est que ça marche, c'est que nous avons de plus en plus de gens qui choisissent la voie de l'apprentissage et qui construisent ensuite des carrières professionnelles avec des compléments qui sont des compléments académiques. Deuxième remarque sur la formation continue. Mesdames et messieurs, la Suisse a une loi sur la formation continue qui met l'individu au centre et qui, curieusement, n'est pas un système avec des obligations pour les entreprises. Et c'est la Suisse qui consacre, avec 2-3 autres pays dans le monde, le plus à cette formation de base et à cette formation continue sans obligation, mais avec des systèmes d'incentives, de taxes, de taxes collectives, comme par exemple des fonds de formation que nous utilisons pour la formation continue. Il existe des fonds au niveau fédéral et il existe un fonds ici dans le canton de Genève que nous utilisons pour des actions de promotion de la formation continue qui fonctionnent très bien. Tout ceci est géré par les partenaires sociaux et l'État en bonne harmonie de façon à ce qu'on puisse délivrer quelque chose qui soit performant. Une dernière remarque peut-être, et je reviens en considération de Deloitte, puisque Deloitte est là aujourd'hui sur la Suisse et les jeunes. Deloitte a mis en évidence dans tous ses rapports le fait que les millennials ne croient pas vraiment en l'État. Oh, excusez-moi, sorry. 3 minutes are elapsed, so I have to stop. But je vais terminer en disant simplement... Non, bon. Yeah. Excuse me, sorry about that, but you know, they're very strict here. En disant simplement que les jeunes ne font pas véritablement confiance à l'État pour assurer l'évolution de leur formation. Et les études de Deloitte montrent qu'on fait confiance à l'entreprise d'abord pour permettre cette évolution. C'est donc une tâche de l'entreprise et ça doit être une tâche du management que d'offrir cette possibilité pour permettre cette évolution. Eux-mêmes se disent d'ailleurs un peu désarmés par rapport à leur propre capacité à appréhender l'évolution des compétences dans le monde. Et je pense que c'est vraiment la démonstration qu'il faut une communauté autour de l'individu et de l'entreprise, avec les partenaires sociaux, bien évidemment, qui puissent garantir l'évolution de cette formation.
Thank you very much. Mr. Mathe. And again, ending on quite an interesting note on the question of trust. And in particular, the trust that exists between whether it's young workers or workers of prime age together with enterprise. And maybe, Mr. Chirguliano, I'll pick it up there. I mean, to bring in the voice of workers, and I know that today is also a very important day. It is the National Women's Strike, so this is the context against which we are bringing this conversation. But maybe can you come into this conversation from the workers' perspective, giving us a sense of whether workers feel that they have adequate access to these learning opportunities and whether the incentives that we ended off the conversation with on stage, the incentive to want to participate in lifelong learning opportunities are attractive to workers, and do workers want to be partaking in what we've outlined and how this works in the Swiss system? Your thoughts, please, sir.
Yes, thank you very much, everyone. And I will warn you, I will speak in German. So take your technological equipment that you have. Ganz herzlichen Dank für die Gelegenheit, hier teilnehmen zu dürfen. Es freut mich sehr. Ich kann mich eigentlich hier nur meinen Vorrednern, meinen nicht ganz Tripartiten, meinen zweistaatlichen und sozialpartnerschaftlichen Partnern hier anschließen. Was ich aber vielleicht auf Ihre Frage hin sagen möchte zur Zugänglichkeit der Lehre, aber auch des lebenslangen Lernens für Arbeitnehmende und auch die Frage der Möglichkeiten, hier teilzunehmen, ist, dass wir eben in der Schweiz ein Problem haben, nicht unbedingt mit dem Willen oder dem Interesse oder des Interesses da teilzunehmen an diesem lebenslangen Lernen, sondern wenn Leute in Umfragen, Arbeitnehmende in Umfragen, ich möchte erinnern, dass, wenn ich mich nicht täusche, mit den Zahlen über 400.000 Personen in der Schweiz, die über 25 Jahre lang sind und arbeiten, keine Lehre absolviert haben, dass diese dann bekunden, dass es fehlt am Geld, und dass es fehlt an der Zeit, sich auszubilden. Und es ist, glaube ich, unsere Aufgabe als Gewerkschaften, gerade in einem System, wo die oder die Bedingungen, die von dem Arbeitsrecht hier kommen, relativ ungenau oder sagen wir sehr großzügig sind, was die Interpretation angeht, dass wir hier in den Gesamtarbeitsverträgen, in den Betrieben, in den paritätischen Fonds unseren Beitrag leisten können. Und es gibt einen Beitrag zu leisten, weil ich möchte auch hier den Ball aufnehmen, den Sie mir gegeben haben. Es ist heute der Frauenstreik in der Schweiz. Ich vertrete auch meine Kollegin, die sich ansonsten hier mit diesem Thema beschäftigen würde, Frau Corinne Scherer, die streikt. Und wir sehen auch, dass es eine Diskriminierung gibt im Bereich der Lehre, des Lehrlingswesens, wo gewisse Berufe, die typischerweise von Frauen ergriffen werden, der Lohn tiefer ist und auch die Arbeitsbedingungen schlechter.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Cigliano. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I made two promises when we started this conversation. I promised that we would not only get the insights from a country-specific case, but that I'd also open up the conversation to you so that you may also bring your comments, bring your questions, bring your insights into the conversation. Now, before I do that, I do want to issue a warning, and it is a more of a dire warning that is more dire than Mr. Methe's timer. And the warning is this: please can we keep our comments and our questions short, sharp, concise, and to the point. If you start making a statement, I will cut you off, right? I will cut you off. So I'm a little bit harsher than the timer. I have the ability to cut you off. All right, so I would like us to maybe start off getting a voice from the employers. And maybe let me get a couple of hands. Ladies and gentlemen, the way we're going to participate is I'm going to ask you to please raise your cards that are in front of you, so for me as to identify who to ask the questions for. We're going to take a question from the employers. We're going to take a question from workers. We're going to take the question from government, as we usually do. So let's maybe get a sense of, from the employer's side, who would like to ask a question. All right, so let me start on the side of the room. Mr. Dutiro, can you please go ahead and pose your question?
Nazipo, in the discussion, a point or reference was made to the informal sector. It was made in the context of migration. But if I think about it from the African continent, the informal sector is a key element of the economy. My question is, what approach should we be thinking about in terms of skilling and reskilling and lifelong learning within the informal sector?
Thank you very much. So skilling and reskilling in the informal sector, especially in the context of Africa, where the informal sector is the largest or larger than the formal sector. Let's get a question from a representative of the workers. So if you are part of the representative, sir, from the part of the workers, please go ahead. Please introduce yourself.
Pero pregunto corto. Juan Antonio Ledesma.
Excuse me, sir. Is it a representation of workers?
No.
No. I'll come back to you if we have time. Please do. Excuse me. I need to make sure that. Are you a representative of workers, sir? Please go ahead.
Bueno, se escucha. Buenos días. De México saludo con cariño a nuestro paisano, señor José Ángel Gurría. Gracias por estar presente, señor. Soy representante, secretario general de la Casa del Obrero Mundial y tenemos una inquietud. Sabemos bien que el objetivo principal de todos los que estamos aquí es la productividad. Si no hay productividad, no hay riqueza y la productividad, Europa ya encontró la solución, que es la capacitación en competencias laborales. Considero que debemos de poner mucho énfasis y me vuelvo a dirigir al señor José Ángel Gurría para que hagamos lo posible, gobierno, trabajadores y empleadores, para que el sistema de competencias laborales sea cada día un instrumento más a la mano de todos los trabajadores. Y esa sería una pregunta, en cómo la OIT puede incentivar este modelo de competencias laborales para generar mayor riqueza en el mundo. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your question, sir. How do we maybe look at the possibility of the ILO playing a bigger role in upskilling so that we can see greater wealth around the world? Thank you for that question. Maybe allow me to get a question from government, please. Is there a representative from government who would like to pose a question in this particular sector, in this particular session? Government, going. Right, so I'm not getting any government representative. Is that government, sir? Mr. 4N, please go ahead.
Merci beaucoup. Je viens du Sénégal et je suis un représentant gouvernemental. Je suis directeur de l'emploi au niveau du Sénégal. Je salue la qualité du débat qui est de haute facture, mais aussi et surtout les propositions de l'État de Suisse, parce que c'est ce dont on a besoin quand on participe à ces genres d'instances. La question que je pose, vraiment, elle est générale, mais s'adresse à tout le monde. On nous parle en réalité d'innovation technologique, 5% des emplois qui sont totalement numérisables et 50% des tâches qui sont seulement numérisables au niveau du reste des emplois. La productivité va augmenter. D'autres parlent en réalité de suppression d'emplois. Mais comme l'introduction de l'électricité, aujourd'hui, on n'a pas la conviction claire que le numérique va faire disparaître complètement en réalité les emplois. On parle même de gig économie, c'est-à-dire de l'économie des contrats, sur lequel on est actuellement. Le monde de demain, l'avenir du travail va être un monde d'exclusion, un monde de menaces, mais aussi d'incertitude. La conviction que j'ai, c'est que dans les analyses que nous recevons, on a toujours l'imagination d'un monde en réalité parfait. Et nous le savons, nos économies sont différentes. Les impacts donc de l'avenir du travail vont être différents. Maintenant, ce que je pose aux différents panélistes, ceux qui sont devant, c'est de nous dire en réalité les pratiques qu'ils pensent révolutionnaires, surtout dans un continent comme l'Afrique, où il y a le secteur informel, où il y a un taux d'analphabétisme élevé, où la formation professionnelle même initiale est vraiment une forte demande. La question c'est, quelle est votre conviction profonde, ce que vous ne nous avez pas encore dit et que vous pensez qui peuvent nous permettre de régler définitivement certaines questions. Je vous remercie.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, sir. That's the voice from the government of Senegal, the Director of Employment. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to take a final question. You see, what young people do, I haven't opened for the question, but the young person is flagging at me to make sure that I include the voice of the youth. So I'm going to concede. And I'm going to allow Ms. Maki to bring in the voice of young people in this conversation before I return back to the panelists to give them an opportunity to respond to the questions. Ms. Maki.
Yes. Okay, my name is May Mekki. I'm part of the Arab NGO Network for Development, and I'm here speaking on behalf of the UN Major Group for Children and Youth, which is the General Assembly mandated and the official and formal platform for the engagement of youth in intergovernmental processes and processes related to sustainable development. So, why when we speak about skills and training, we always speak about things such as entrepreneurship or programming? Why do we always focus on the needs of the market instead of the needs of humanity? I see no mention of skills or training for sustainable development or for peace, for example. So we always talk about STEM or engineering, but I mean, our economic system treats the creation of a weapons engineer the same way we treat a medical engineer. So there is really a need to transition from a discussion that focuses on skills and trainings that are a tool for young people just to get into an economic system that is already destroying our planet to a discussion that focuses on humanity needs. So I also would like to ask another question. What I'm trying to say is that we need young people that are able to participate in democracy, young people that are able to participate in economic paradigm shifts. We need young people who are able to protect the planet from the corporate capture over public good, etc. I have a question that is specific to the Arab region, and I would really like to hear the opinion of the panelists on this matter. So in the Arab region, usually when we speak about, when we focus about skills, usually the discussion is shifting away from the responsibility of shaping policies that generate decent jobs. And of course, usually social protection and other pillars of decent jobs are left out of the conversation. So I really would like to hear what you have to say about this and how we can link this discussion to macroeconomics again.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Maki. So ladies and gentlemen, there you have it. We've got a series of very robust questions that have come from the representation from workers, they've come from employers, they've come from government, but they've also come from the voice of young people, and some tough questions coming from the youth voice today. So good luck to my panelists for this last part of the conversation. So, and maybe what might be a good place to start is that I'll start with Mr. Greer. I'll work my way this way, and then I'll come to you as well, Mr. Albrecht. We have a question here, Mr. Greer. One of the questions that was asked, and this was on the representation from the workers of the world. I think he was sitting over there, and he spoke about this, the focus on productivity missing in many of these conversations, and saying, should we not be focusing the conversation a little bit more strongly on the skills that will drive productivity? Could we not be ensuring that the conversations, including with the ILO, focus on this so that we can really start moving towards a broader creation of wealth across the world?
Productivity is what seemed never to have been closer at hand because of all the information that we have, because of the digital revolution, and because today we have it at the, just click of a button, it can come to us. And we've never had such a prolonged period of low productivity, and we have a situation where productivity is actually falling. 2 decades ago it was 2.8, 1 decade ago it was 1.8, now we're below 1%, and it doesn't seem to be catching up. So there's a paradox, just like the paradox or the puzzle of the technology not disseminating fast enough. There's no the leak down to the small, medium enterprises, etc. So basically, it doesn't happen simply by looking at the skills themselves, but without greater skills, you will not have productivity in any case. So if you're going to start someplace, I would say skills, skills, skills. Yes, upskilling, reskilling, targeted, however. Targeted. It's not going to do the trick. Just the Swiss case is very clear in terms of this dialogue. The German case is very clear in terms of the dialogue. Where do you need it? The Singaporean case, which are these very successful cases. Where do you need it? Because you kind of have a tailor-made demand for it, so then you satisfy it. But then there's another problem. The regulations need to be in place. The flexibility in the labor markets need to be in place. And then you need to resolve this problem that we mentioned earlier, which is that half of the workforce, which is the least trained, will be less trained. And therefore, that les écarts, the differences, will be growing wider and wider and wider, simply because this is not going to be sustainable socially or politically. And therefore, we see today that in all these results, unexpected results, the political results in the elections, everywhere what you see is the same single message, which is the public is, the people are angry, the people are dissatisfied, the people are frustrated because they don't seem to look at the system that will solve my problem.
Right.
That is not happening. So therefore, we need to get in depth. We need to have the financial systems in place also. The smaller and medium enterprises, which are the ones that are creating more jobs today, do not have ready access to to credit, and we have to take a look also, as I said, the gender divide.
So, Mr. Greer, when you started your response, you said skills, skills, skills. And I want to maybe link, and I'll bring this to you, Ms. Agrawal. I want to link it to the question, the first question that came from Ms. Maki, and she says, at what point are we going to stop solving for what the market needs and what skills the market needs? And what point are we going to start solving for what humanity needs? And I know this is a difficult question based on what we've just heard, but I'd love to get your voice on that.
It is a difficult question, but I'm going to make an attempt by saying that we have to recognize that we need lifelong learning because we can't predict what the future is. And therefore, going back to the question, it is about equipping people with basic human skills that come to us naturally as humans, but also going back to the question that was asked, which is around thinking about our world as a whole and not just about what the market needs now. Because what the market needs now is anyways not going to be what the market needs tomorrow. So let's focus on the skills which are very germane to us as human beings so that we can adapt and be flexible to respond to the next big crisis that comes our way.
Mr. Grandi, I'd love your voice on this conversation that's unfolding. Thank you very much, Ms. Agrawal. And maybe I'd like to bring in the question that came from Mr. Dituro, who kicked us off. And he spoke about how do we begin to think meaningfully about the informal sector, especially the African context where the informal sector is far larger than what makes up the formal sector.
Yes, earlier we heard very negative opinions about informality, and which an opinion I share, but we should also remember that at least for the people we're dealing with, but not only refugees, migrants, all the people on the move, informality can be the only alternative to dependency on aid, or even worse, dependency on smuggling, trafficking, and abuse. So we need to be careful in how we deal with that particular matter. Here, and we've already spoken about skilling and policies and so forth. Here, I would like just to say, since we are in a dialogue with the three groups, with the three parties, that to address this issue, I think that one has to appeal to a sense of responsibility in different ways. Responsibility of states to enact inclusive policies, and this is particularly difficult for migrants and refugees. They are foreigners, they're not nationals. It's a difficult political choice. And then a sense of responsibility, I would say, of the employers who would be tempted to employ at conditions that are informal, let's say, and sense of responsibility of the employers to employ at decent conditions so that informality is avoided.
Mr. Albrecht, I'd like to bring you in, especially on the note of to employ on decent conditions. I know you probably have views on the other questions, but as you respond, can you also respond on the final question that was raised by Ms. Maki as well, to say, well, through the Arab lens, how do we make sure that even just the conversation on employment practices and labor policies that lead to decent job creation are a part of the conversation as we move to the reality?
Yes, sure. I think that is a very important point, because skills alone won't do the job for decent work. There are other circumstances we need, and they are linked to that. You mentioned social protection, which is important. We also heard about social dialogue, collective bargaining, because we see that workers that are in formal employment, who have a union representation, they are much, and the higher education, as you said, are much more likely to get the skills too. So we have to take a look at it all. And it gets even more complicated when we talk about what the colleague from Senegal talked about, the gig economy. We could see that we will have more and more platforms where work is carried out in a worldwide, no longer supply chain, but networks. So the danger I see is that in some countries, this is good job opportunities to work on platforms. But if they stay in informality, these platforms, people move from informal employment to another type of informal employment. And in countries like mine, people move from formal employment into informal employment. So we have to make sure that these platforms are also part of the formal economy and part of the formal employment system. And that is why I introduced into the Global Commission the idea to have an ILO convention on platform work, to make sure that we have certain rules that are applied everywhere in the world, and that could include the right to get skilling. because a platform saying I'm no employer will not provide any skilling for workers as well, and they will not provide any social protection, they will not provide for collective bargaining. So I think we need a regulation there that is enforced globally to make sure the platform workers and everybody in what the OECD calls the gray zone between employed and self-employed, they have some rights. And that's why I call for universal labor guarantee, another idea from our commission, saying that every worker, no matter what employment status, has certain rights, including the right for representation and for collective bargaining, as well as social protection, healthy workplaces. We have to make sure that skills are seen in a free framework of decent work, and to have an overall approach to this for different types of employment emerging as the world of work is changing through digitalization and other trends.
Thank you very much, Mr. Albrecht. Mr. Chimoli, let me bring your voice in here. This idea of us having to think very meaningfully and very deeply about informality and trends that are emerging in certain markets, like we've said, the gig economy, the platform economy, which are creating pathways from formalized work to informality. Your thoughts on that? And it dovetails into the question that was raised from the government of Senegal.
I want to say something about that is very important. Not because we have digitalization, everything is modern and perfect. We have to be clear about that. Digitalization many times created more informality and more risk, and people more vulnerable. Take the case of an app, of the people that drive in the mode, bringing your food every day. These people don't have contract. These people don't have any agreement. These people is not protected. These people have a private contract. Now, we need to create something, a regulation, where the new technology is not to be, again, a process where we're creating a double informality. That's the first point. The second one, informality is clearly a moral ethic process. It's some possible solution for the people that don't have the possibility. But informality is very important because you speak about productivity.
Yeah.
When you improve informality and you give people better jobs and more firms, you can increase productivity. But be careful about that. Take the case of small and medium firms. Most of the employment in Latin America, in Africa, is in small and medium firms. They are really a very low productivity. And we need, in these cases, not only digitalization. We need a broad policy, because we have, Angel said, if you have the firms, if you don't have financial asset, access of the small and medium firm, there is no way. You can put all of digitalization. We can create a good skilled people, but these people is going to drive it or send it the products in the market. It's not to produce it, nothing modern that is going to be called that. We need a comprehensive policy. Sometimes we forget that because digitalization has arrived, it is not more needed industrial, technological, and regulation policy. And we think that more and more are policies that really more and more important, particularly for developing world.
Final thoughts, Ms. Maria. A lot's been said on the panel, so I'd love to get your views on some of the questions that have been raised, but also just your view on this emerging conversation around small and medium-sized enterprises and workers in that particular context within mostly informal markets as well.
Thank you. In fact, in Singapore, we are increasingly quite concerned on these platform workers as well. Although the percentage is not very big, I think we have about 10%. But I think, more and more of I'm not sure whether the young people, I seem to hear that they like such economy, gig economy, where they can have flexible time, they can have their own flexibility as well in that sense. But in Singapore, we are really getting very concerned. The labor movement, together with our tripartite partners, we have been having this engagement. So we actually form a work group to address some of this issue. And even the Ministry of Manpower come in as well to also help to mitigate some of the cases, especially that's happening to these freelance workers, as well as, anything that we can do to help them to reskill. And from our perspective in the SNTUC, we actually help the national instructors and coaches to form an association. They are not part of the union in that sense, but we help them so that we can have the engagement together with them, and so that we can also help them to reskill to come up with causes that are very specific to them. And of course, the other thing that we are very concerned of is the social protection flaw. At the end of the day, when they get older, when they retire, what do they have so these are some of the critical issues that we are looking at. But what I'm comforted is that we have now formed a tripartite work group on this.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Ms. Mary. So some elements of the emerging future quite comforting, but there are some real challenges that still need to be taken on. Now, ladies and gentlemen, as we begin to close this conversation, I think what's been very clear is that we've touched the surface on a lot of very important issues. What gives me confidence and comfort is that we've also raised further questions that are necessary for further discussion. And I think this is the purpose of a really good conversation. It's not always about getting answers to the questions. Sometimes it's about bringing about new questions and reframing questions in a different way. So as we begin to close this conversation, I'm going to invite each of my panelists, and I'm literally going to give them about 30 seconds each, for them to give, in a statement, a high-level idea that they would like for each of us in this room to walk away with today. One final idea on what they would like us to remember as we walk out of this room. Now, the context of where we started is important. We started by looking at the impact of these transformations. We navigated our way to begin to talk about what innovations from a policy perspective, whether it be labor market policy or broader economic policy, would be necessary to support and facilitate lifelong learning. We began to have a conversation about the incentives that we need to put in place. We opened up the conversation to get a country-specific example of how this might work. And what we got from the conversation that you brought into this dialogue was that there are issues around informality and formality. There are issues around the emerging gig economy. There are issues that we need to think about whether we are prioritizing the market over humanity. So lots has been said, and I'm going to start with Mr. Greer, and I'm going to be very tough because I'm literally going to keep everyone to 30 seconds. So Mr. Greer, you go first. In your 30 seconds, what would you like us to walk away with today?
To understand that nothing is going to happen by itself, that you need specific policies to address each one of the challenges. And second, as Mr. Chimoli said, that you need to mix the different policies because they are mutually reinforcing and their absence will be mutually weakening if you don't put it together.
Fantastic. Now, that's a great start to the rest of my panelists. That's the example that we're going to follow. Short and sharp and to the point. Nothing is going to happen unless we are proactive about those policies. And importantly, we need a mix of policies. We need a comprehensive set of policies to move us forward. So, Mr. Grandi, the challenge is up next. So I've got Mr. Greer on the leaderboard right at the top. Let's see if you can outdo him.
I'm at the top because I'm the only one.
Well, inclusion is a very political act, whether it is in the world of work, and when in particular it concerns the most disenfranchised and unpopular people, the refugees and migrants. So my thought I want to leave behind is that this can only be addressed through a whole of society approach. So I appeal again to the sense of responsibility, not just to the interests, but also the sense of responsibility, not only of states, as we traditionally do, but also of employers and employees to make this inclusion possible. It will require some political courage.
Sure. A challenge, ladies and gentlemen, for political courage. Inclusion is fundamentally and inherently political. Could we rise up as states, as employers, and as workers to begin to think about a whole of society approach? So, Mr. Albrecht, first place, second place is taken. Let's see if you can knock them off the leaderboard.
I think the most important point is that the future of work is already there and it's changing dramatically fast. 3 years ago, we all talked about robots in manufacturing. Today, we talk about artificial intelligence, and there will other topics come up next year. So I think we really have to keep things very fast. And if we talk about a smart economy, a fast economy, we need smart and fast regulation and framework setting as well. We need changing social dialogue. We need changing policies. We have to recheck. If we introduce, for example, an ILO convention on platform work, we have to recheck it every year to keep it updated. So we really, all of us have to change if we want to set the right frameworks, because the target still is the same. We want decent work also in the future.
The future of work is here, ladies and gentlemen. We need fast and smart regulation. We need fast and smart social dialogue as well. Mr. Chimoli, let me bring you into the conversation. 30 seconds.
I want to say that if I take middle-income countries and developing countries, I say, don't take this opportunity. We don't cry on ourselves. We have to do policy. We have to create policy. We have to be active. We need to put clearly that this has to be read as an opportunity. That is an important point, because if we continue to cry on ourselves and to think we have any opportunity, this clearly is going to be another opportunity, has to be lost.
Thank you very much. So, direct message, we need to do more than just cry for ourselves. We need to roll up our sleeves and make sure that the policies are in place to reap the rewards of these opportunities that are inherent. Ms. Agrawal, final one before we get to Ms. Mary.
So the future is now, and it's very exciting because I think it's an opportunity to unleash human potential in ways we haven't seen before. We have to be cautious about technology, because I don't believe it is about technology. It's actually about humans, and let's take shared responsibility for that.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, it is about humans. The future is now, and we have a collective responsibility to unleash human potential. Ms. Mary, will you take us home?
Well, thank you. We can have the best of plan in this world for the future of work, but it will be meaningless if we do not translate that to the ground, to the workers. So for me, every worker matters. And it is important for us to have the social dialogue and keep it going. Tripartism is alive in this house. Thank you.
The best of plans, ladies and gentlemen, are insufficient. What we need is to be proactive about being proactive and deliberate about translating this for workers on the ground. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like you to please join me as I give a resounding round of applause to my panelists this morning.